Beyond the headlines. This is World Insight.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm your host, Tian Wei. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has called on the international community to rally support for the United Nations Charter amid geopolitical and economic uncertainties. Wang made the remarks while presiding over a top UN Security Council meeting on strengthening the UN-centered international system. The participants agreed that the UN Charter remains a relevant and as ever and the trend of world multi-polarization is unstoppable. Wang also spelled out China's key role in upholding multilateralism as a steady defender of the UN and fair global governance. So, for insights on the UN values and beyond, let's loop in our panelists. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Yukong Huang, Senior Associate with the Carnegie Asia Program. Also in D.C., Surab Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist with the Institute for China-American Studies. In Berlin, Ulrich Brugner, Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies at Stanford University. In Beijing, Rong Ying, Senior Research Fellow from China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Now, at the just concluded Group of Friends for Global Governance being held at the UN headquarters, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spelled out 9 priorities for China as a Security Council member, have been talking about some of the major roles that China wants to see the UN plays. For example, enhancing the UN as the world body, UN peacekeeping operations to the demands of the time, regulations of artificial intelligence for the world, and the list goes on. So, Mr. Rong, as a Chinese scholar, what much does that say about China's anticipation and confidence of the United Nations?
Yeah, definitely. I think the 9 priorities that Wang Yi spelled out as a kind of direction for China, the UN reforms or global governance reforms, represents not only the confidence and also, I think, commitment of China in pushing or building a better world, if I can say. And particularly in the wake of the last year, UN celebrated the 80th anniversaries, and the Chinese came up with a global governance initiative, 5 sort of pillars, and also in the wake of the challenges, the emerging issues, but the most important that I think China has been tried by working hard with partners to push or implement the push for the implementation of these initiatives.
Right. Well, this is, of course, at a time when the UN is being challenged by the possibility of being sidelined, for example. And also, we have been seeing that there has been a lot of aspirations of the United Nations, and yet actions are not followed, particularly by some of the member states of the UN. So, Yukong, you've been working for the World Bank in earlier years. China's approach, what does that say to you? What does that mean for the UN system?
Well, if I speak about the World Bank and the IMF, affiliated agencies for the UN system, I think a big issue is the continued promotion of free trade, capital movements, exchange of ideas. There's been a lot of restrictions on technology movements. There's been a lot of protectionism, tariffs, splintering of trade blocs, a lot of movement against trade agreements. I think these are all against multilateral and globalization in general. I think the world has certainly lost a lot in the context. This leads to lower growth. Countries' economic policies get repressed. So I think there's a major issue for the UN to see whether they can fight this force of anti-protectionism and more globalization.
Well, there are a lot of words, of course, in the speech that's familiar to political scientists and yet unfamiliar, of course, for many folks who do not follow politics on a daily basis. But some of the key issues are quite clear. One, Surab, is whether the UN Charter is still going to be upheld by its member states. As we know, the UN is an entity, and yet eventually who decide on the decisions made by the UN is its member states, and whether actions are being followed by the decision is also up to the member states. So, Surab, what do you think could be, the current stage of the UN's role, and If China's expectation is that here, what could that mean for the UN?
The UN today still has a very important role, if nothing from an internal perspective. There has been, as you mentioned, a breakdown.
Your voice is not very clear at this moment. I'm afraid I have to move on to Ulrich in Berlin. So Ulrich, your thoughts on the same question?
Well, first of all, before we go into details, let me say that everything that helps to restore a functioning global order is warmly welcome, no matter who takes the initiative and what exactly is the message in this case, the 9 points. What we have right now is a global order that was designed at the end of World War II, and this neither reflects the current balance of power, nor does it represent the rest of the world that isn't there in the important institutions. So there is an urgent need to have a functioning global order. We don't know yet in what direction we are moving, but any initiative to build a multilateral order is warmly welcome, especially from the place where I speak, which is Germany, that is a member of a functioning multilateral system, the European Union, and therefore we all know how important it is to have a rule of law-based system of self-binding commitments.
It's very interesting that you raised the question whether it is because the UN Charter is not up to the task or the UN system not up to the task, or it has been rules and yet those rules are not followed by some of the member states. Those are very different questions. So Yukong, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think increasingly we see a global system which is being dominated by great powers in some ways. And I think the US, China, Russia, they are sort of like exerting their influence in their parts of the world. Middle income economies are also trying to exert a role for the middle income powers. We don't have a system which now says, should the world get together and address these issues together? Increasingly, the US is basically pulling out of the system. They've withdrawn from WHO, for example, precisely at a time when the Ebola pandemic would require greater collaboration. When you had problems in Gaza and the Middle East, the United States created its own peace fund to try to provide support, although financial support through the Middle East should be ideally going through multilateral agencies like the UN or the World Bank. Instead, you have bilateralism. So instead of moving to a more multilateral world in which UN agencies could actually play a more important role, we see increasing domination by what I call great power interests.
We see the world has been shaped by different rhetorics, that's for sure. And yet, whether those different rhetorics, as mentioned by some of our speakers, are actually realities or is only part of the realities, is the rhetoric going to shape the world eventually, or they're just part of the evolving stories? Those are very interesting questions, I have to say. Ying, tell me more about your thoughts.
Well, I think it is true that on the one hand, United Nations and the international system underpinned by UN and international law are not perfect. It seems that given the challenges we are facing, and given the realities, as a matter of fact, that we have undergoing, this is not we are not living in a perfect world. The question, or I think the China's initiative, the global governance initiative, as a very important effort by China, and also I think those who continuously believe that multilateralism, UN system, that we need to do more to improve and reform the system so that it would adapt it to the reality. And equally important is that make it more representative, effective. That is, I think, the sense of the general consensus emerging at last year's UN global compact. And the question is, of course, it has to be implemented. And it will also have to be implemented through by upholding multilateralism and international law. That is, I think, what China is doing, China is campaigning, if I can say.
All right, Surab, your thoughts. I understand from my producer that the voice is okay now. Go ahead.
I hope I'm coming through clearly. the UN has a very important legitimizing role, and the fact that many countries still champion and value the UN itself, it helps protect multilateralism and the cause of multilateralism. The problem has been that there has been a breakdown in the commonality of purpose, and unfortunately, much of that breakdown is within the P5 among council members. We have this current Israel war, and we didn't even have a UN General Assembly vote per se of condemnation.
I'm sorry, it is still not very clear. It's very broken, I'm afraid. So I will have to let you to figure it out a bit later. So let me move on to another question, because we've been talking quite abstractly about the United Nations. Among some of the points that China raised also got echoes from many UN member states. Even a question like AI governance. You see, Yukong, that overall already there's a high-level advisory body of artificial intelligence being established for giving advice to the Secretary General. You also have, this high-level international scientific body that is providing other evidence and advice to the UN system on artificial intelligence, and yet none of them so far over the past few years have been come up with rules and regulations that can be accepted by the UN member states. So, Yukong, is it that these mechanism does not exist, or it is that the member states are not necessarily providing momentum and steam to the already existing system? Just to look at the issue of artificial intelligence governance alone.
Well, you hit on a very important point. Artificial intelligence is an activity which many countries are trying to push forward in. It's a potential security risk for the world if it's not handled appropriately. But there's a lot of competition to see who's the leader. And countries have approached artificial intelligence differently. In some countries, you basically allow everything to be going forward without much regulation. Other countries are very concerned and have a strong interest in regulating it. It's like nuclear proliferation. If globally you recognize that there are risks as well as benefits, then the world has to come together in some way to regulate it. Well, if you don't have a consensus of views among the major powers in terms of artificial intelligence, how it should be supported, how it should be promoted,
right,
and to what extent should the technology be shared.
That's exactly why you need to have a mechanism within the UN, which is almost representing, all the voices in the world, to be able to provide a platform. And with that platform, to come up with actions and suggestions that will be followed by the member states. That's the question, isn't it? Ying, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the AI or artificial intelligence definitely is a very good case of an example. Again, China has been very active and by coming out its initiatives, its views, and for example, first and foremost, how the international community should look at or view the role of AI in a sort of objective way by taking into account both the pros and cons. Like all the previous emerging technologies, it can bring a lot of goods, but also I think a lot of bads. That's why the Chinese came up with the principle of AI for good. And the second thing is, of course, related to the principle is AI, the people-centered approach. In other words, in the end, AI should help improve or bring more benefits for the common progress and development of humanity. But last but not least, as other, technology, private technology, they all can cause a lot of destruction, a lot of debate, at least the last weekend, the Shangri-La dialogue and then other security dialogues about AI's role in war fighting. So how to ensure AI is not misused, and what will be the guidelines, guardrails to ensure that it would not be misused. There are a lot of debates, and I think all in all, China with an idea, but it has to be worked together with all the members and the global South in particular, those which has been lagging behind. So I don't think we want to see an AI gap at the digital gap we had in the past, and for the global South in particular.
Yeah, Oleg, your thoughts?
Well, as long as we just talk about simple words like good or beneficial, everyone would agree and we don't understand a thing. It's a question of power, good for whom, and what are the initial idea about how to use a technology that we are far from understanding what it will bring. First of all, it is a massive dequalification technology because a lot of skills are no longer needed because the machine can do this. Then it's a wonderful oppressive instrument for totalitarian dreams to come true, and it's a massive money machine. So depending on what we see, first of all, when we look at AI, we come to very different conclusions about who should regulate it and how should it be regulated.
Yeah, as complicated as you just described, I'm sure the list of complication is much more than what you just suggested. Maybe some don't even agree with what you suggested. But anyway, that's exactly why we talk about the UN, isn't it? Our topic is not artificial intelligence, but how the artificial intelligence governance can be better done if we have a platform of the United Nations. Surab, once again, my producer told me you're okay in the voice. Go ahead.
It's, the artificial intelligence is a technology which is increasing and with leaps, and it's not going to be the technology and in the
I'm afraid I have to tell my producer the voice is not okay for now. Yeah, thank you so much. So the other thing that many people talk about, Yukong, is the funding of the United Nations. I understand that there has been $2 billion, for example, owned by the United States to the UN, and on top of the $2 other billion related to the peacekeeping funding that the U.S. should pay to the United Nations system. But this is just according to some media reports. How do you see, as someone who used to work for the World Bank, the funding issue is for the UN, and if it is an important platform, what can be done by the member states?
This has been a perpetual problem. Governments have pledged a certain amount of funding on an annual basis, sometimes long-term basis, but they always end up delaying the payments, jeopardizing the viability of many of these agencies. In some cases, they don't pay up at all. The U.S. is a major example of this. I don't see any easy way to solve this, especially since everybody is now, all major countries are experiencing fiscal problems and financial problems. So you're going to see a lot of difficulties in collecting money. And this is true in terms of the foreign aid, generally speaking. Bilateral aid is being cut back. Multilateral aid is having difficulty raising funds. So I think this is a major issue because you don't have a real commitment to financing these agencies. And I think part of the issue is that there is less of a consensus on major issues. We've talked about AI as one particular example. And earlier I mentioned WHO health issues, pandemic. We used to have a strong agreement that you need to address this globally. Trade has also fallen by the wayside. WTO does not have support. Climate change has now also fallen by the wayside. We used to have a global agreement on the importance of climate change. UN agencies worked to take a leadership role in fostering a global agreements in these areas. Again, it's weakened. So I really think that the problem with the UN system is that we now don't have a broad agreement on many of what I call the global public goods issues. That's the role of the UN agencies, to deal with issues which are cross-border, global issues, which affects everyone. And we used to have a consensus that these issues were important, that they had to be addressed collectively. And when you reach that kind of agreement, then the UN system has a major role. But that agreement across all these issues has broken down.
But Yukong, if I could be blunt here, is it about many members of the United Nations that do not agree on the consensus already reached, or just one member of the United Nations that actually has been having great problems with all of these?
Well, when the U.S. steps back, as you mentioned, in a leadership role, this of course affects the global system. This multilateralism, this globalization for the last half century was led by the United States. When it's pulled out, it basically weakened the whole system. The question then is, can the rest of the world find a means of collaboration? Take the potential collaboration between China and Europe. China and Europe share many principles and themes, whether it's in climate change or trade. But even in those areas, Europe and China has a hard time forging a consensus, because if they could forge a consensus,
But this is
puts
an
pressure on the
interesting
United
logic
States.
because you're talking about bilateral first. In fact, the reason there is multilateral platform is because there are a lot of discussions that can be going on all at the same time, and therefore multilateralism can serve even sometimes as a better tool than even a discussion between two parties, as the two parties mainly are looking their own interests and their own interests alone because it's multilateral. It's bilateral, rather. So this is an interesting question. Ulrich, your thoughts on this?
Well, I had hearing problems. Can you repeat the question?
The question is how multilateralism could function, even though sometimes a bilateral discussion may not be necessarily reach all the goals.
Well, the experience from the European Union is that if a single country is trying to hijack the system, then it is doomed to fail. If powerful countries are willing to accept decisions that are not necessarily in their benefit, but they are committed to self-binding commitments, then you can expect that this is a functioning compromise machine that is, of course, difficult to communicate at home because you don't get the maximum result. But you get consecutive compromises that in the end will everyone make a winner in a win-win situation, which is much more beneficial than a self-blocking tendency that we have seen in United Nations records.
Now, Ying, your thoughts on the same question?
Well, I think, as we all know, that China is an advocate of true or genuine multilateralism, thinking that this is the only sort of effective way to address the differences and seeking common grounds. After all, I think we all agree that differences do exist, and interest as well. So how to ensure the overall interest or common interest will prevail despite the individual differences is an issue. And as far as China is concerned, China strongly feels that to believe that seeking common ground and shelving differences, but in this regard, in particular with issues on global governance, on making the UN system more effective and representative, I think everybody will have to take the overall interest of the common interest of the international community into consideration to ensure that in the end everybody will be the winner. That is the idea of win-win sort of cooperation, if I can say.
Well, we're reaching almost the end of our program today, but there's one question that we need to ask, which is the new UN Secretary General. Of course, Mr. Guterres has been serving his term, and with high comments coming from many different stakeholders for his job. But the UN certainly is going to elect to find a new Secretary General. According to the Chinese Foreign Minister, this person needs to be defending the purpose and principles of UN Charter, have rich political and diplomatic experience, comprehensive coordination capabilities, upholding justice on major issues, and also be able to attach importance to the interests, aspirations of developing countries and grasp the right direction of the UN reform while boosting the efficacy of the UN work. That's a lot of priorities, but for anyone sitting in that job with the reform agenda of the UN, all these are very crucial. Let me go to you, Ulrich, very briefly about your thoughts on having the new Secretary General at a critical time.
Well, you can also add a number of other personal qualities, but in a functioning multilateral system, the human factor is less important. We have seen success stories in a functioning multilateral system with a relatively weak president or leading position because the machinery is working, given the fact that everyone accepts the rules of the game. If this is functioning, then we don't need to care about.
Well, that is not necessarily the case, right? That's why we had the discussion today, that you have a weakening role of the United Nations apparently being reflected in many different areas. And therefore, what is the role of Secretary General? We are not in an ideal situation.
Yeah, but you cannot upload this on the skills of a single person and make this poor person to fix a dysfunctional order. This is far too much expectations.
Well, it is not going to be a poor person who is going to be the Secretary General of the United Nations, but rather a capable person, especially right now. Yukong, your thoughts on the priorities for someone who are going to fill that job?
You have a real problem because the qualities we seek for someone to become the head of the UN are very admirable. But in fact, you can't reach an agreement among the major powers, the people who control the selection process, because they cannot agree upon an individual. And in general speaking, you find a compromise. And this is not good for a system when you always search for a compromise candidate rather than look for real leadership.
There are a lot of questions about the future of the United Nations, and we hope with concerted efforts, or at least trying for concerted efforts, some of the solutions can be sought. We want to appreciate your support and your discussion. Thank you, Yukong Huang and Uli Bruckner Rong-Ying, and also our earlier speaker, Surab Gupta. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel, follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.
You've been listening to programs from CGTN Radio.
CGTN Radio.
We invite you to visit us online for more audio, pictures, and in-depth reports. At radio.cgtn.com, you can access a wide range of programs and find your favorite news, talk, features, entertainment shows, and podcasts. Hear the difference with CGTN Radio.